Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this side event by the Civil Society Financing for Development Group, including the Women's Working Group on FfD. The focus of today's side event is on the road to the 76th UN General Assembly and the need to be focused on the key FfD systemic governance reforms to advance the 2030 agenda. My name is Pooja Rangaprasad. I will be moderating the discussion today. I am based in India and I work for Society for International Development. We coordinate the Civil Society Financing for Development Group, which is an open civil society platform of hundreds of organizations and networks from around the world that are interested and engaged in the UN's FfD process. We are, of course, here at HLPF discussing the implementation of Agenda 2030, and we have COP26 coming up, and really central to successful implementation of these commitments are really the issues that the FfD agenda tries to address. Financing for development process is really about addressing the global systemic barriers to ensuring developing countries have the fiscal and the policy space to address their development challenges. And at the heart of this agenda is really about addressing inequality between countries as decision-making on critical issues of the global economy and finance continues to happen in undemocratic spaces such as OECD, Paris Club, World Bank, IMF, and so on. And the need to really bring these decision-making processes back within the UN, which is the only space that ensures that all developing countries have a seat at the table. So even before the crisis of the century that we're all experiencing now, we were deeply concerned that the world was already completely off track in meeting these important commitments. And this is now, of course, further exacerbated by the current COVID-induced crisis. The vaccine injustice means that the road to recovery will also be much longer for developing countries as they have to wait much longer to open up their economies fully, which is only possible once their populations are fully vaccinated. So we're really stuck in this in quite a vicious cycle, and it's really against this background that for us it's been unconscionable that governments earlier this year agreed to adopt an FfD outcome document that was really filled with rhetoric but no actionable outcomes. And so the upcoming UN General Assembly, particularly the second committee, it's really critical for us that it doesn't kind of unfold in this sort of business as usual approach, agreeing on the lowest common denominator, and that instead we really, that governments really come together and work together to ensure that we're making these ambitious decisions on these critical FfD systemic reforms. And so to help us talk through all of these issues, we have an excellent panel of civil society experts today who will provide an overview of some of these issues that we're talking about and why it is important to move so urgently within the upcoming UN General Assembly. So to kick off these discussions, our first speaker will be Mr. Derece Alemayehu, who's with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, the recently Nobel Peace Prize nominated Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And it's a pleasure to have you here, Derece, and the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the kind words as well, Pooja. I'll just have 3 or 4 points to raise. The first one is, let's go a bit back to the Financing for Development conference in Addis Ababa. As you know, the draft conference outcome was not agreed in New York, and they came with a draft to finalize it at the conference. There was a paragraph in this draft which was a proposal from the G77, which said the establishment of a UN tax body. The rich countries said, they not only said we don't accept it, they said they will not take part in the negotiations if this paragraph remains in the draft agreement. So the host country at that time didn't want the conference to fail and put pressure on G77 countries to accept this dictate to save the conference. at the end of the conference, the G77 did a declaration saying, we have withdrawn this paragraph from the agreement, but we have not given up the struggle for the establishment of a UN tax body. So what were the G7, the rich countries doing this? Why were they doing this? Because they didn't want the UN to be the forum where international tax rules are discussed and solved. They wanted this as an area where the OECD has to play the major role, the main role, the convener role. It was to block the UN and leave the issues of international tax rules setting and standard setting to the OECD. And it is very clear why this is their preference. In the UN, the negotiations are open. Countries negotiate in a transparent manner. We get the draft agreement beforehand to put our government, to make our government accountable for the positions they are taking and not taking during this negotiations process. What does the OECD offer? A, it has created an informal structure outside the UN where membership is voluntary, nothing, but it is behind closed doors. It is so secretive, and the secretariat of an international multilateral conference should be neutral, but they have their powerful secretariat as a host of this process, a manipulative one. So it is behind closed doors. We don't even know what positions our respective delegates take. So this is the process. It is opaque, it is not transparent. The second one is, during some of the informal consultations, there are some positions taken by developing countries individually or collectively, like the G24. And then when you look at what comes out of it, it has become a Bermuda Triangle. They disappear. And you hear that they have unanimously agreed to something. Some complain that there is a political pressure. So it is happening in this manner. It is very opaque. There is political pressure. There is the pressure of the usage of carrot and stick in this process. There is the biggest weakness of developing countries. They don't coordinate before they go to these fake negotiations. So this is one. The second one is the G7 meet as a summit level, take it as a political process and decide it as heads of state. No developing country is allowed to do that. The technical staff going to these negotiations is asked to agree to something, and it becomes a binding agreement, which is contravening the sovereign right of nations to agree to an international agreement in an intergovernmental process. We have seen it during in the past. So this is the other one. You compel, coerce technical negotiators to sign to something. You take it to your own decision-making summit. You decide on behalf of the whole world and say, this is the global agreement we have reached. So this is, and then you look at the outcomes of the negotiations. Now, for example, the whole mischief about transfer pricing abuse, profit shifting happens because multinationals are not treated as single entities, that their consolidated global profit is not apportioned according to the source of their profits generated in different economies. Now they are telling us, we have solved it. 90% of global profit will be dealt with in the traditional manner by transfer pricing rules. The 10% will be apportioned democratically. So is it the way of solving a problem? You take out 10% and say, this is how we want to change it. And you leave the 90% intact. Plus the scope is about 100 multinational corporations, not the whole thing. Okay? I mentioned this not to go into technical details. The second one is they say, so the split between residual and routine profit has been objected by developing countries, the G4, the G24, ATAF, and the rest. But it is still there, intact. Now you take the pillar 2 thing called minimum tax. The average multinational corporate income tax is 25%. The secrecy jurisdictions and tax havens were offering 12.5%. So they brought it so close to the secrecy jurisdictions. What is starting now? Imagine a country a developing country, which has a statutory corporate income tax of 35%. They don't have the economic and political clout to negotiate better terms. There will be a pressure on them to reduce their nominal tax to 15%. This is instead of doing away with race to the bottom, this has started a process of race to the minimum. And then when it comes to the divergence between the tax paid and the under-taxed profit, it unashamedly gives the right to tax this under-taxed profit to headquarter countries. So in short, it is an unfair system. And why is it being happening? You block the UN from taking a decision, from facilitating an international agreement. So you preempt a democratic decision, a fair decision, and say you have solved the problem. So what is happening is to preempt a decision and say the job is done. So now that is why the G77 should be more active, because they are failing. We hear, there was the Nigerian ambassador to the OECD said, we are under political pressure, we are forced to accept these rules. It is the only space, the UN is the only space where they will not say we are being treated so and so to agree to something we don't agree to. So what I'm saying is, it is very urgent. We should not allow the rich countries to confront us with a fait accompli. We have to be urgent and bring it back to the House of Nations, in which each country can decide for itself in a negotiation atmosphere based on equality. So let us not allow them to preempt a solution, to confront us with a fait accompli, and the UN should be reclaiming its right. It should not give the mandate it has to solve international problems to usurpers who are claiming to make rules. Neo-colonialism is gone, but neo-colonialism is still there. Those former colonial powers want to keep developing countries in their tutelage. But we have to be grown up and bring back the issues to the United Nations, where we are treated equally, where our concerns can be also dealt with in an intergovernmental process. Thank you, Pooja.
Thank you, Dereje. I know, of course, there's so much focus now on the global tax deal in the headlines around the world. So that's, I think, really useful. I mean, in the process of OECD making sure that they remain in power to design this standard, they have actually upheld an outcome that is, of course, as you mentioned, negotiated behind closed doors with no accountability, but also that's completely ineffective. I mean, we're still upholding an international tax system designed in the 1920s for 90% of corporate profits, like you said. So I mean, on the one hand, we're wondering where will the money come from for SDGs and the climate crisis, and then on the other hand, we're still all governments around the world losing so much revenue to corporate tax dodging. So it's really critical that, I think, like you said, that we really move on this process in the UN and addressing these loopholes. So with that, I will move on to the next speaker, and this will be Ranja Sengupta from Third World Network, and will speak to the issues around trade and investment. So Ranja, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pooja, and always a pleasure to be here as speaking to the FfD group and all of us who are working also on the SDGs, and bringing some of the trade issues here, because we've seen that in this space, trade is not such a big issue, because it's kind of believed that trade has other forum, there's the WTO and so on. So trade discussions should go there. But I mean, we've been trying to continuously bring actually trade issues to other spaces, especially to the UN, because we actually have hope of getting something progressive and positive in UN platforms rather than really say in the WTO. And a lot of the trade discussion and policy making is kind of scattered over multiple spaces. So that's why we see UN as actually one space where all different strains of the trade and investment policy discussion that's critical, especially to our times during the pandemic. And that's what I will primarily address. And we see that solutions for the pandemic, which are related to trade and investment policy, really needs to be centralized, and we think UN is the best space for it. So first of all, of course, we know that we have all seen trade and investment policy is critical for the solutions of COVID. I mean, trade and investment, I think policies for a long time have also contributed to a lot of the problems around how this pandemic has been huge, and how we do not actually have access to essential supplies, whereas the trade investment, all these different agreements that are there, they have, I mean, we've always been told that all those policies and institutions will facilitate trade and facilitate access to a lot of these essential goods. And we've seen in the time of the pandemic that we do not actually have access. Very few countries control, for example, all trade in medical products, whether it's PPEs to masks, to ventilators, to vaccines, to medicines. And anyway, so most of you, I think, are familiar with these trade agreements to a certain extent, and that's what I will speak on. So we, of course, have the WTO, which kind of forms rules and forms agreements on a multilateral level. Then we have the free trade, bilateral free trade agreements, regional free trade agreements. Then we also have investment agreements. So a whole host of agreements, each of them have include a different combination of very critical issues, right? Like, so from rules on industrial products, so say health products, to agriculture and food, to intellectual property rights, to services, liberalization. Now we have a lot of new issues, investment facilitation, e-commerce, and so on. Now, what we want is these agreements, as I said, should give us solutions to the pandemic and not create further barriers. But what do we see? We don't see that. From what we've seen from last year is that many times when governments have tried to bring in policy to be able to deal with the pandemic, whether it's provision of certain goods and services, to making certain restrictions, for example, on closing airport because you want to restrict travel, because you don't want the virus to spread. Or when governments have, for example, made certain hospitals, COVID hospitals. Just one second, I think that's my phone. Sorry, I forgot to put it on silent. Yeah. So, so when we see that governments have tried to take measures, lot of the rules that they have signed on to in these trade and investment agreements are actually keeping them from having the policy space to put in all the policies they want to fight and deal with the pandemic, right? So I mean, many of you, that how the intellectual property rights issue, what the TRIPS agreement says is that we have to give, for example, in this whole vaccine discussion, that we have very expensive patented vaccines, but that is not accessible to everyone, because that prevents producers all across the world who are able to produce, it doesn't allow them to produce. And the WTO, through the TRIPS agreement, have upheld those kind of restrictions and constraints. So there's that, there has been this whole like effort from developing countries to push a waiver for COVID related therapeutics, diagnostics, and so on. But I think, so one is generally all these trade agreements with their bits and pieces have been constraining our governments to pursuing COVID related policies freely, right? And we have said, but I think one big challenge has been the investment agreements and the investment parts of the free trade agreements. You know, even the free trade agreements and regional trade agreements also have investment chapters. So what, I mean, many of you have heard of the now infamous ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement. These agreements allow, so if a foreign company has invested in a certain country, they have very strong rights, and that is much higher than the domestic investor. But what the, so if the government in fact changes any policy, then they can actually, policy or expropriate their investment, which then they feel that it will lower their profits. They can sue governments in secret international arbitration cases. We don't even get to know what's happening. And so we have seen host of these cases happening. And over COVID measures, I mean, I think Peru was threatened because they took a COVID measure, and they were threatened that the company which was affected will sue them. Then in Chile, they actually have faced cases over airport restrictions and so on. And so as I was saying, in the ISDS framework and the investment treaties, which give such strong protection to foreign investors, is actually really hampering our government's policy space to put in pro-COVID measures. But as I said, this is not only limited to investment provisions or investment agreements or investment chapters. It is also stemming from services chapter, IPR chapter, goods chapter of these agreements. So basically from last year, we have been really calling for a moratorium on all these trade and investment agreements, so that governments, especially developing country governments, can, you know, reclaim the policy space to put in place the policies they need to fight with this pandemic. And so we have seen a whole lot of recommendations, for example, coming in the WTO from last year, but actually they offer very little policy space. They have focused on some very key narrow issues, mainly on interest to developed countries. For example, they want more market access. They want countries to reduce import tariffs. They want countries to not restrict exports. But then we have seen the US and EU have been the major ones actually restricting exports, say, of vaccines, critical vaccines, and so on. So we have seen a lot of recommendations coming mainly from developed countries, which do not practice what they preach. And those recommendations have been highly inadequate. But what we have been asking is that governments, at least for this period during the pandemic and for a certain period of time after the pandemic, they should actually have a moratorium on all trade and investment agreements and all these legally binding commitments, so that they cannot be sued for not implementing those commitments during the pandemic times. And especially, I mean, at least at the minimum, putting a moratorium on ISDS cases. And one thing, as I said, these ISDS cases are not allowing governments to freely pursue COVID-related policies. But the other thing is, you know, during the pandemic, for example, my country, India, has lost this big case to Keynes Energy, which is a British energy company, for a 1.6 to 1.7 billion US dollars. I know Pakistan, our neighboring country, lost, I think they've lost a $6 billion cases. So even if these are not related to COVID policy, the fact that they are going to have to, they're forced to pay such huge compensation for losing these cases to these companies, these resources could have been spent on, you know, COVID vaccines. They could have, I mean, probably, you know, vaccinated their entire population. Pakistan could have, with the money they'll be paying out to these companies. So these are critical resources during a pandemic. And because our governments have signed on to such very, very unfair and opaque systems, you know, in these trade and investment agreements, that they are actually having to now pay for it, which really compromises their ability to deal with the pandemic. So this moratorium, but governments then should be free to take these necessary actions, or at the minimum become more self-reliant. You know, like even rich countries, US, Germany, they are talking about how they become more self-reliant, especially say in health products, food products, and developing countries need to be self-reliant for critical, you know, medical products that they have sometimes the ability to produce, but they are not able to produce because of different barriers posed by this whole trade and investment framework. So let me just quickly end with why the UN, why, so what I started with, because people will say that, why in the UN? You have the WTO, or even in the UN, there is some discussion. For example, there UNCITRAL is discussing ISDS reform, but that is not specific, firstly, to the pandemic. It is not responding to a crisis. It's simply a process issue, how to make this whole ISDS system less opaque, how to avoid conflict of interest and so on. So make it like, less gray. But what we need is something which allows government full policy flexibility to respond to the pandemic and also prepare for future pandemics. The UNCITRAL reform does not call a halt, to this whole very, very unjust ISDS system. Then there are tidbits, you'll find in different fora. In the WTO, the Ottawa group, which is Canada-led group, developed, and some developing countries, they put forward this proposal on trade and health. But again, no focus, say, on technology, on IPRs, on the issues that matters. But, it's actually in a way disguised agenda to open up developing country markets and, force countries not even to do export restrictions, for example, even their own domestic needs. But then at the same time, the proponents themselves are not following what they are preaching. So we have all kinds of different bits and pieces of these so-called solutions, but we have not seen something positive. The only positive one we have seen is the TRIPS waiver proposal. So that's going on now. We didn't really believe we could actually challenge this whole IPR regime, but that has been challenged. We now have negotiations starting. So that is a positive thing. But what I am talking about is this very comprehensive, multi-pronged approach, which would address WTO plus the free trade agreements, investment treaties, which will address a whole host of provisions. And I think this moratorium, and it's already late, this moratorium will be crucial for this pandemic, but also looking at, future pandemics, future crises. It may not be a pandemic, it can be a huge environmental crisis. And then how will our governments have the policy tool? So we need a discussion on a moratorium now, but also a comprehensive solutions for pandemics and crises of the future. So that's what I think the FfD platform, the SDG platform, and the UN platform in general really need. We need to get together in order to ask for it. And I think the UN space has a lot of opportunities that it can offer. And I think if we push hard enough, we should be able to get the solutions we need. Thanks a lot, Pooja.
Thank you, Ranja, for making a very important case. And like you said, the question is always why the UN on such critical issues around trade and development. And I think you made such a strong case for it can't happen anywhere else but the UN, and the UN General Assembly is there precisely to be able to respond in the moment of this kind of crisis. And so we've not seen that yet, and hoping, and of course this discussion is really to propel the ambition that we need with the upcoming UNGA. So thank you so much for your inputs. With this, I will move on to the next speaker, which is Yolanda Fresnillo with the European Network on Debt and Development, and she will speak to issues of sovereign debt. Yolanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Pooja. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. And thanks, a big thanks to Derje and Ranja. Listening to them I think we need to remind all the time that without tax justice or without trade justice, we can't have debt justice. As countries are denied their own resources, they are denied fiscal revenue that should be theirs and go into tax havens, or they are denied, as Ranja was mentioning, the policy space needed to fight the pandemic. They are condemned to continue borrowing, and they are condemned to getting deeper into this spiral of debt that many countries in the global south find themselves in today. In the last decade, public debt of developing countries has increased from an average of 40% of GDP to 62% of GDP. More than 1/3 of this increase took place in 2020 alone. This figure is equivalent to 1.9 trillion of new debt in just 1 year. This is one of the impacts of the pandemic, one of the somehow invisible impacts of the pandemic. In the last decade, the share of government revenues in the global south used to meet external debt service has increased from 6% to 17%. And today, more than 30 countries are allocating more than 20% of their revenue to debt service. This means that instead of fighting the pandemic, instead of investing in climate resilience, instead of investing in SDGs, they pay their external debts, sometimes debts that are illegitimate. In the context of this unprecedented economic crisis and unfolding debt crisis, the G20 and the IFIs have offered short-term and limited responses to the situation. For us, they are not more than false solutions to make sure that nothing changes substantially. The evident shortcomings of the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, and of the common framework to deal in a timely, orderly, comprehensive, and especially in a fair manner with debt distress, while protecting human rights, gender equality, or the path towards SDGs, tell us how vital and how urgent it is to put in place a systemic debt architecture reform. Unfortunately, we are in a position to say that this reform is far away. We need to put a lot more pressure into international institutions, but particularly in the UN spaces, to step up and reclaiming and working towards this debt architecture reform. Both this DSSI and the common framework fail in many different ways. Some of them is they don't ensure binding participation of private creditors and then deny the participation of multilateral creditors. So there's not going to be any multilateral debt relief or even debt restructuring. And there is a huge question mark on private creditor participation in debt relief. There's no existing framework for countries outside this small group of 70 DSSI countries. So middle income countries are systematically excluded from debt relief initiatives. Countries like Suriname or Belize that are at present negotiating debt restructuring with their ruthless creditors that are denying deals to these countries. There is no human rights, SDG, or climate vulnerabilities approach to debt sustainability. Debt is being considered by the IMF or by the World Bank sustainable in many countries where governments have to actually cut health expenses in the middle of a pandemic or have to cut climate investments in the middle of a climate emergency. This is the way they see their sustainability. It's just the way if countries can pay, then that is sustainable. It doesn't matter if that impacts gender inequality, if that impacts the climate investments needed. We need also to mention the dysfunctional role of credit rating agencies and the financial markets, deepening the debt vulnerabilities and creating pro-cyclical worsening of this economic and debt crisis. We could just mention today's news with Ethiopia Eurobond yields increasing just because they announced they would like to see a reprofile, a rework, not a debt relief of $1 billion US, just a change in the conditions of in which they want to pay this debt, and they are punished just by saying it by the financial markets. And the other issue we need to take into account, and I think this is related to what Derija was saying, is the exclusion of countries in the global south from even the discussion and the decision making on the solutions to their own debt crisis. So it's a system, it is DSSI and common framework decided by and for the creditors' interest. In this situation, without an ambitious and multilaterally discussed, democratically decided and fair process leading to debt cancellation, the resulting crisis will keep exacerbating the already staggering levels of social and economic inequality, both between countries and within countries. Without a sufficient debt cancellation available for all the countries that need it and from all the creditors, there's no chance countries will be achieving the sustainable development goals. But also there is no chance without debt cancellation that countries in the global south will be able to face the challenges of the climate emergency. This is being said again and again by the countries in the Caribbean, by the small developing island states, and no one seems to listen to them in the international financial institutions. Again, such a fair, timely, and lasting debt resolution will never result from discussions among the creditors without the voices of the people and the governments from the global south. As Derege stated in relation to the tax agreement, this DSSI and this common framework come from decisions made by a few in the name of the many. Therefore, the people and the planet need not only more ambition in terms of more debt cancellation, but also much more democracy for those solutions to be fitted into their needs. And this is where the UN should take a step forward and say, we are the space where these decisions should be made, because this is the only space where countries in the global south have actually voting and voice rights. To finish, as civil society, we keep calling on governments to establish a debt workout mechanism, a transparent, binding, multilateral framework, rule-based process for debt crisis resolution under the UN auspices that addresses unsustainable but also illegitimate debt, that provides systematic, timely, and fair restructuring of sovereign debt, but also debt cancellation in a process combining all creditors, bilateral, private, but also multilateral creditors. For us, it is evident that addressing the debt architecture reform only focusing on new versions of collective action clauses, introduction of state contingent clauses, or other market-based contractual arrangements won't be enough and will fail at putting human rights and particularly SDGs at the center of the solution. Beyond the establishment of a multilateral debt resolution framework, or within this reform, we need to urgently implement substantial reforms in the financial system, including further regulation of the financial sector, binding rules for responsible lending and borrowing, and regulation of credit rating agencies, and a global agreement on the importance of capital account management and control. To conclude, we believe that the organization of a UN summit on financing for development and the next UN General Assembly are key to advancing this agenda, to advancing in these systemic and urgent reforms of the global financial architecture. We hope the governments will be up to the task and advance towards this agenda at the next UN General Assembly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yolanda, for so comprehensively laying out these false solutions right now that are being discussed as solutions even for this crisis, and what the alternative really should be. Of course, we know that developing countries tried this in 2014, 2015. And I guess the question we ask in civil society is if member states had agreed then to a multilateral legal framework, navigating this current debt crisis wouldn't be as challenging. So we already missed an opportunity a few years back, and we really shouldn't do that again and repeat the same mistake. So we're looking, I think, forward to the upcoming UN General Assembly to revisit that ambition and really make sure that all member states come together and agree this time around. With that, I will move on to the next speaker, Emilia Reyes, who is the co-convener of the Women's Working Group on FFD, to give us the sort of gender perspective on this entire agenda. So Emilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I actually don't think I need to say anything else after hearing my colleagues making such a strong points, all of them, on why we want a UN summit. But let me just start by saying that we are in the context of the HLPF conversation, and this is why today the Women's Working Group is standing in solidarity with the Women's Major Group campaign in bringing a new color and a new message every day. So today is orange. If we were at the hallways, you would all be wearing the scarves that the UN, that the women's major group would be providing to you. So we owe you that for next one. But we were very happy to see member states all around the hallways in New York wearing a different scarf every day. So today is Human Rights for All, and very timely for the conversation we're having. And I just wanted to say that before we start, that this is not about a conference in the UN. This is not about a negotiation, another negotiation more. This is about going back to the origins of a multilateral pact that is universal. This is really, I just can't emphasize enough, humanity is at a crisis. People are dying everywhere. And we have also an environmental crisis that is unmatched, unparalleled by anything that we have seen. For the first time, people is thinking whether I'm going to have children or not, because they may not survive in the next generation or two, just two. So it's really insane. And what we are calling for is going back to the original mandate of the UN on really taking back the main conversations, even of survival of humanity and life in the planet, and take it back to a universal space, a multilateral pact in which we can all discuss and have a saying and share the problems that are not going to be solved locally. And I am stunned by all of the proposals on national reports everywhere, because no country in the world is going to be able to face all of these macro challenges that my colleagues have been saying, and no country in the world can ensure the minimum standard of living for their population, or address any of the emergencies of survival that we're facing right now if we don't deal with these macro issues. So I'm really stunned. There is a meme going on in Mexico that says the UN is that friend you have that when you're really in your worst crisis of your life tells you, don't cry. You know, people is making fun of the UN, and I think it's very accurate, actually, that meme. I would have used that as my background if it weren't because of the women's major group messaging today. It is really that bad. It is really that bad. It's like we're heading towards a General Assembly, and we are not making any relevant decision, not any. We're losing on all the fronts, all of the battles. And the call for an FfD conference or a Monterrey Plus or a FfD Summit, whatever you want to call it. I would like to call it FfD Reloaded. But anyway, we are open and flexible with the name. It is really what is at stake, and why can't we deal with any single issue of the UN, any human rights? Out of the questions, governments come with an informal understanding already to negotiations like in climate change, biodiversity, anything, that human rights is off the table. Even for a ministerial declaration that is going to be voluntary, it is off the table. Nobody wants to come and talk the operationality of human rights. And those are discussed for the human rights rapporteurs, those are discussed in another fora that is like a schizophrenic voice, because on the one hand, human rights rapporteurs are telling us PPPs are violating human rights. They're telling us that debt is damaging and harmful for human rights of all people, women, youth, people with disability, and austerity measures, that IFIs are recommending things that are in the detriment of the survival of the planet. And on the other end, they keep on doing that. And we keep on hearing all of those recommendations that they do. I mean, Reyes spoke about the colonial dynamics currently now, and Yolanda and Ranja in a way reflected as well on that. And we keep on hearing that is going to be addressed on the G20 or the G7 or OECD or the Paris Club. Why? So what is the use of the UN? And at this point, the FfD and civil society in general is in desperate need to see the UN back to its original mandate, all of them. Humanitarian, we're seeing a huge crisis everywhere, but this is not only so much a humanitarian crisis, it's a humanity crisis. And we're not seeing even that dealing with the UN. Human rights, development, we're not seeing any of those. So this is really crucial. And I just wanted to emphasize some aspects of this in relation to macro agendas that are used to be considered as let us say, individual or grouping ones or specific ones. So this is why I'm like the weather girl here, changing my background, just to say why from the women's working group, we're always emphasizing women's human rights. And I keep on saying women subsidize the entire economy. No, let us see this pretty beautiful drawing in which we see that this is the generated value in the world, generated value. And so these 2/3 are produced by the unpaid domestic and care work of women. This here is voluntary work. This is where you will find men in community work receiving no payment. This section here is paid domestic work. This is where all of the externalization of work women from rich classes, middle classes do with migrant women, with indigenous people who have informal hirings and maybe some trafficking, etc. And this here is the segment of all of the millions, all of the money that circulates in the world. This is money, this is monetized value, this is non-monetized value. So when we say that women subsidize the world, it is this big. And when we have life here around, is that women are not only holding economies, but life itself. So this is not about reproductive. No, this is about productive as big as it gets. You will not find any Gates being or Bezos being as productive as women, or any technology, any being as productive as women. And when we're come back to the negotiations on FfD, which by actually is the only negotiation in the package of the Sustainable Development negotiated outcomes, you know, SDGs, Paris, Habitat, Sendai. This is the only one that has operative language on women's human rights, the only one. And yet we are told that let us go back to national reporting on women's empowerment. We're talking, they're subsidizing the economy, and we are told that they will get microcredits. I don't know the term in English for usureros. They are profiting from in the lousiest cheap manner from women in bringing them in reproducing the low scale end on their precarity of conditions, because here in monetized value you will have informal and formal work, and women are 60% of the population in informal work, so that means precarity, poverty, etc. Actually they say, oh, there is a poverty, a feminization of poverty. No, it's just that women make the best poor ever. There is an exploitation, there is a reasoning why women are the best poor ever. So we have informal, precarity, and then we have formal. And informal, formal work, you will see gender wage gap, etc., the glass ceilings, whatever, 1% of the population holding the concentration of wealth. And you will see that last year, billionaires made $10.2 trillion out of profits from the pandemic, 10.2. Last year, if you were to pay these women the minimum salaries, they would make almost $11 trillion. So you would see the correlation of the extraction, you know? And why am I saying that? Because in CSW, they say, well, this is not voluntary. And then we go to the zero. And let me tell you, zero is addressing structural things for the first time in the lifetime of binding treaties. They're saying tax is a violation of human rights in the global south, tax havens, tax loopholes, illicit financial flows. They're saying extraction in the Arctic is a violation of developed countries. Developed countries are violating women's human rights in the global south because they're doing extraction in the global north. But why can't we have these conversations thoroughly together? Why in the UN? So we are saying we need to bring that back to the General Assembly. And let me say, because Lori is asking a very relevant question, where does this lead racism, systemic racism? This is a white supremacist world. This is a colonial world. And I'm just going to say the very same data we all have and why this is also macro. 6% of the population in the world is indigenous peoples, and they're holding 80% of the biodiversity in the world. And we're still questioning them the basic rights. And that is a conversation that FfD needs to hold into account, because it is about sovereign space, policy space. What are you going to do to ensure human rights for everybody? And let us not go into the intergenerational rights, because in 2 generations, youth now don't know if they will survive or their kids will survive. So what are we doing now? I'm just going to say before closing, the Canada and Jamaica process last year and this year, it's I'm sorry to say this, to be this irreverent, it's a laugh. This year we're having subgroups and clusters with member states and UN agencies meeting together, and they say as an outcome, let's have this menu, and everybody keeps on raising their flags and say, but this is not a negotiated outcome, so this is not binding, this is not even negotiated, this is not even non-voluntary, this is just non-negotiated. There is a menu, and then we are told, okay, so what's next? What's next is, let's do advocacy messaging and communication messaging. And I'm thinking, we have UN agencies and member states here, and the action is advocacy. To whom? To the G7, to the G20, to the OECD, to the Paris Club, to the corporations. To whom are we thinking they are powerful, they have the solution, they will make the decisions, not us, because there is no space in the FfD process, in HLPF, in the Paris Forum, in the UNFCCC. Where is it then? So what I want to say is take claim and ownership of the General Assembly again, and plead the member states to release them of this kind of servitude that Dereje was saying. Why are we told we can't do anything? Why? People are dying. Ranja was telling us about the vaccine injustice. It is obscene, it is outrageous, it is out of our minds. The UN needs to get back on its feet and act. And we're counting on member states from developing countries and some who have sense in the developed countries to give up their powers and really start addressing the problems that people need the UN to start addressing again, as they did back in its origins. So thank you for this.
Thank you, Emilia, for so helpfully, I think, tying all the threads together of the previous speakers' proposals and placing it so clearly in what this means for really the world, for the people, and why this kind of macroeconomic agenda is so central to the planet and to the people. So thank you so much for the very powerful kind of closing remarks of the civil society presentations. To just sum up what the proposals have come up from civil society so far, we're really calling on member states to work together at the upcoming UN General Assembly and agree through UNGA resolutions the next FfD conference, Monterey +20, FfD Reloaded, as Emilia said. I mean, we can call it whatever you want, but we really desperately need to address these issues and the need for the next FfD conference. Again, we also, through UNGA resolutions, need the debt workout mechanism that Yolanda spoke about, and a multilateral legal framework to prevent and address the debt crisis, a moratorium on trade and investment agreements that Ranja spoke about, and the need to establish a UN Intergovernmental Tax Commission and agree on a UN tax convention to address all the loopholes in the international tax system. So there is a lot of work to be done, and we are done waiting, and we expect these decisions to happen in the upcoming UN General Assembly. So now we have, I think, a couple of respondents from the Mexican government that I will hand it over to, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. Feel free to continue posting your questions in the Q&A chat box or writing your comments in the chat box. You can also raise your hand once we open up for discussion. So maybe first I will move to Monica from the Mexican government to maybe respond to some of these proposals. Very warm thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you, Poyat. It's very nice to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. Just like listening everybody, it came to my mind that, of course, because of this COVID-19 crisis costs more maybe aware, like for all countries, that we really need to invest in the SDGs if we really want a better future and a greener future. So that will be very, very important. And finance for development turned to be one of the topics that immediately all countries start talking about. We address it in any forum, in the G20, in the UN. We created like different forum discussions, and we were not able to find like or reach a common ground about all the issues that were addressed there. We think that maybe we can push for engaging in a process of a new financing for development summit. But of course, because of this crisis, it will be not so easy and maybe not a priority. But it has been 20 years after Monterrey, and maybe we really think to engage people and also the civil society and also the private industry in this new kind of process, maybe by different small dialogues like the one you have today, in order to start moving towards more open conversation. Of course, Mexico has been very engaged in this Friends of Monterrey process, like for the last 5 years. And even we have skipped one because of this COVID last year. But we think that this Chatham House process, it has been proved to be very good. It's like people are very honest conversations. So we think that maybe that will be a first path to go towards, to move. That will be like my remarks.
Thank you so much, Monica. And indeed, it would be, it makes a lot of, first of all, that it's great that, you know, there is support for the need for the next FfD summit. And I think perhaps some of the concerns you raised around what it means to have the summit in this moment of crisis, I'll also move that question to the panel if they want to respond to that. There's also a similar question in, I think, the Q&A. So we can take that together. With that, I'll hand it over to Rodrigo now, if you would like to complement some of Monica's comments. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, Pooja. And thank you, all of you, for all the powerful and very interesting remarks. It's just a lot of food for thought. Just following up on what Monica was saying. Yes, I mean, maybe you were involved or have read some of the outcome documents, but from Mexico, we have been to a certain degree in favor of this next UN conference. You know, the FfD process is at the end of the day one of our say our babies, right? It was born in our country, so we are very fond of it, and like as much as we can, we have been pushing, just as Emilia was saying, to bring back the UN to its original mandate and have this very wide convening call for everyone to just sit down and agree on the most important issues at stake on a one-on-one basis, where everyone is at the same seat, right? So yeah, we at like given the present context, we are very concerned about how we are all collectively dealing with the matters at stake. Within the G20 and the DSSI, we have been pushing a lot for, you know, at least the countries of our kind, right? The middle income countries. We believe the things we have done have been insufficient. We have been pushing for the current initiatives to be more open and be accessible to the middle income countries who have been to a certain degree pushed away from the opportunities that rose in the previous months. It has not only been within the G20, but also within the FfD Forum, for example, within right now the HLPF. We'll be pushing the same initiatives towards the General Assembly. We have been also unsatisfied about the vaccines process. We have been pushing a lot within our possibilities, a more inclusive, at least, you know, dialogue and language that may allow to bring those who are most left behind to have the access to accessible and a dignifying access to the vaccine, right? Because it's basically at the core of any possible recovery from the pandemic. And at the same time, we have been pushing any gender aspects. We believe also that there is no resilience and there is no sustainable recovery unless it brings gender issues to the forefront. So those have been our banners for the past few months, and trying as well to raise a voice for the global South, right? At the end of the day, we are a country from the global South. We have some privileges in some of our memberships that are we're trying to make the most out of it, because we're very concerned about the impact of the pandemic in terms of inequalities and the creation of fiscal space. We're very concerned that the scarce resources are not arriving to the places that they are most needed in many countries. And within the Mexican governance, we're also trying to make certain adjustments, trying to allocate the resources where they should be, where we think they should be. And yeah, I mean, we maybe to summarize this, we're pushing to have an equal response to the impact we're having right now. And certainly we believe the UN should be at the forefront of this process. That the efforts of the previous months, as well as the development process of the past decades, has been evidently insufficient. So we want more. We will be asking for more in the multilateral fora we participate in. And yes, like that's pretty much it. Just pushing for equal responses to this very complex and massive impact we're suffering right now across the globe.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. And thank you both, Rodrigo and Monica, for taking the time and responding. And it's great to see a positive response to supporting the call for the next FfD conference. I may have some follow-up questions on how we can perhaps move more concretely, but before we get into that, I also do want to open up the floor to receive questions from those who have joined us today at the webinar. We already have one question that I think I will, maybe Emilia, you can start with that, and I'll give a chance for the rest of the panel to respond to as well. Which is asking, I understand why a UN summit seems appealing, but given the current reality of decision-making and the inadequate results in that forum, what will be different? So I don't know if maybe Emilia, you want to kickstart, and then we can go around the panel. Thanks.
I can try to give it a go. But you see, despite my fiery words, I'm still a formalist, you know? I still believe in structures. So we're just pushing the blocks as much as we can to build the structure that we need. And all of this civil society is really on the side of the UN, by the side of member states, by the side of movements. And we're really trying to push all the blocks together to make it right. And I think we have to try. If the UN is the proper space, regardless of the conditions that are out there, we need to fight the battle, and maybe we will lose. Maybe the historical conditions are not there, and maybe the humanity will die, maybe life will die, but we need to give our best shot. And we need, and I think this is why the conference, I think it's so important, because it would be compiling all of the greater demands for the survival and well-being of humanity and life in the planet as we know it. So I think that is a major appeal for everybody to commit. And at the same time, it's a big spot for let us say powerful actors to come to the table and sit and giving either a little or to blackmail some outcomes. We've seen that in the FfD in 90s. We saw that with ODA, but at least we need to try. I don't think we're naive, but we don't want to be cynical either. So it is a combination of also understanding, and let me say this from our perspective, human rights, gender equality, environmental integrities are not ideals. There are technical tools as well that help us work better, achieve results sooner, and encompass a larger dream that can be feasible right now, precisely because states are there. My feminist view is like states are this third actor that can really work towards planning, towards implementing. They raise revenue, etc. They can operate at big scale and think way ahead, and the UN is really that space where we can do that together. So I don't have a nice reply to that. I just think that we need to try, because that is the proper way to do things. We cannot see life ends as we know it without doing anything. And there are many member states, let me say, because I'm super happy to hear Mexico here saying this, there are many pivotal states that can play a role in moving and shifting dialogues from one space to the other. And sometimes Mexico will go with the other side, and sometimes another country will step in, and civil society is there. I just want to think that we need to try. We need to move the blocks. This is the time. If we don't do it now, with a pandemic threatening millions of lives and with an environmental emergency burning 100 people in Canada dying, 100 people dying in 1 week, it is unheard of. We need to act now.
Thank you, Emilia. Yolanda, would you want to add something? Maybe Dereje, just to get you up to speed, we've just opened this up for discussion, and the first question we're addressing is from Barbara, asking why, even though I understand why a UN summit seems appealing, but given the current reality of decision making and the inadequate results in that forum, what will be different? So maybe you can think about it, and I'll ask Yolanda and Ranja to weigh in, and then come to you, Dereje. Yolanda, the floor is yours.
I think it's, as I said in my intervention, to be in the table is important. And at present, countries in the global south, states in the global south, as Emilia was saying, are not in the decision table, are not invited to the decision table, are not even consulted. If we get a scenery where they are in the table, we can push them. Otherwise, it's push them without them being able to actually make a difference in the negotiations. And we have experiences in the past, and you know, 20 years ago, Seattle, Prague, and many other occasions. I think the UN FCCC negotiations are also an example on how, if countries in the global south are in the decision table and social movements and are pressing, and we are strong and pressing, we can get decisions. As Emilia said, we need to be not naive, but this is the only way, because otherwise we would be betraying ourselves. I mean, we cannot push for decisions being made at the G7 or at the G20, because it's not legitimate to take these important decisions in those spaces. So we need to go on. I don't know if you want me also to. I want to answer the question also on systematic racism. Can I?
Yes, go ahead and
Okay.
answer that, Lisa.
Because I think it's a key issue, and beyond the inheritances from the colonial times and neo-colonial dynamics, there is definitely a systematic racism and discrimination that contributes to that crisis. And one of the issues I just recall a study made a couple of years ago, 2019, it's 2 years already, demonstrating how African countries were actually paying more for their debts than their macroeconomic indicators would indicate, because of the perception of the financial markets on at the African economies, and this is a racist perception of the African economies. Not only that, but there is an issue that we normally don't address, which is household debt, and how in a situation of high public debt, families get into debt because of the state failing delivering public services that the people need. And this has a highly racist component, because it's normally women of color and migrant women who go into those debts just to cover for basic needs. And there are studies and there are increasing publications pointing out these linkages between sovereign debt and public debt and this household debt that affects especially women of color and migrant women. I think it's something important to take into account. Thank you.
Thanks, Yolanda. Ranja and then Eradicate to respond to that question. And then I see Robert has raised his hand to ask a question, so I'll hand it to him after that. Thanks. Ranja, yours.
So quickly, I mean, I share your views on the UN, Barbara. I mean, I think we have all collectively been increasingly disappointed with the UN, and what it could, we think, potentially could have given us, but it has failed us many times. And increasingly we have discussed this in the FfD space also, we see weaker and weaker resolves on part of the member states to engage with the UN process on FfD, and therefore, of course, expectedly weaker and weaker outcomes. But I think there are also some good reasons at this point why we want this summit and why we think we should be able to get something positive. For one is, where I come from, we work in the WTO space. I mean, that's not better, let me tell you. I mean, I think the UN still offers us maybe one of the more, if not the most, but more democratic and open and participatory spaces. And in WTO, for example, and even when engaging, in this whole trade and investment policy making, from free trade agreements to investment treaties, it's all extremely opaque. There is no participation. We are not called to the table. And why we? I mean, even I think many developing country members have been increasingly sharing their frustration that they are actually not part of the decision-making process. So therefore, I mean, I think in comparison, the UN looks really good. And I think if we have to pin our hopes on an institution, it would be the UN. The other thing is also this, this whole interconnectedness of all our issues. I had just put it in this chat box that these issues that we are talking about, tax, debt, trade, investment, technology, women's rights, human rights, these are all linked. And I think the UN kind of offers this space where all these different aspects can be married and combined to come up with comprehensive solutions. Because if I go to the WTO, I will discuss trade. At most, I will discuss trade and development, trade and technology, and so on. But I will not discuss all these issues together. And I think that is the value of this UN space, UN with also its different agencies, which are specialized to work, in these different trajectories. And I think to bring in all that in together and really look at comprehensive solutions, I don't really see any other space. But yes, I totally agree. I think we have to push the UN, we have to engage, we have to be you have to continuously try to get these issues on the agenda and ensure that it's actually then, and even just having a summit is not enough. We have to make sure, certain qualities and principles under pin that summit. So I think with that, I am still optimistic.
Thank you, Ranja. Dereje, did you want to come in on why we want to be optimistic on the UN?
There is no alternative other than it. No, this reminded me of a German development economist about 30 years ago. What he said, African governments have failed to deliver. What he was suggesting was we cannot expect from them anything else. Africa should be declared, put under UN administration, so that the necessary requirements are fulfilled for making the states work. The governments are not working. So what is now big in preparation is to bring us back into feudal structures. Those who are rich should decide, because that is exactly what Keynes said when the IMF and World Bank were created. And then the then independent developing countries were also invited. Said, what are these apes trying to find you? They have no money to manage the global financial system. So this logic is coming back. It is making the UN is a chatterbox. The UN is ineffective. So you give all the resources and the mandates to non-democratic institutions like the G24. And then we are back into feudalism, where only those who have money, who have property, were voting and deciding on the destinies of countries. So it is not about being pessimistic or optimistic. There is no alternative. I'm a smoker, so when my lighter does not work, I'll throw it away and buy another one. But if an institution is not working, it has to be made working. We have no alternative. Otherwise, we will give power to the rich and then say, we have nothing to do, let them decide the affairs of the world. And the other thing is really, during the OECD inclusive framework discussions, we hear from the diplomats, from revenue authorities, that there is a huge behind-the-scene pressure on people to take decisions. But when it is a UN forum, there are more vigilant eyes. We have a space to intervene. We have space to influence the outcome, to influence the position of our government, and to hold them accountable. There is all this dynamic. And the United Nations is not only an assembly of nations, it is also an assembly of peoples. It has this dual function. So it is also our citizen, our right as citizens of the world to make this institution work. Because the alternative is Pax Americana. It is going to be, the deal of the rich is going to be the global deal. To prevent this, we have to mobilize peoples and put governments under pressure to make it work. So we don't have alternative other than being optimistic about the prospect of moving governments to this challenge in the UN process. Thank you.
Thank you, Dereje, and everyone for those reflections on that, I think, very important question. I will ask Robert now to, I think, ask his question. Maybe you could also introduce yourself to the panel. Robert?
Thank you very much, colleagues. My name is Robert Suna. I am an independent consultant on tax, trade, and investment, and currently based in Uganda. I'm also coordinating a project, an European Union-funded project on fiscal justice for women and girls in Africa under FEMNET. But I originally worked with Tax Justice Network Africa. I'm very excited about the whole discussion, especially creating the linkage between trade, tax, and investment, because often we discuss them independently. So when I saw this call, I thought it is the right time to discuss the same. But my comments are on two issues. One, first of all, when you see Dereje and my sister from Eurodad passionately discussing World Trade Organization issues and tax, my concern is to take us back on the history of the formation of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. I mean, if you look at the treaty establishing the International Trade Organization, which was meant to work on issues beyond tariffs and work on investment, employment, and the rest. Unfortunately, the USA at the time did not agree to that treaty. And consequently, what happened is that the Bretton Woods institutions chose to use the GATT as a de facto international organization. Now, my challenge is that when you look at the trade agreements and investment treaties and tax treaties, they are so much linked together, but we try to say they are not linked. So when you see such a discussion brought to the UN level, I think it's very critical. Now, my challenge is that whereas the International Trade Organization's formation was to make it a UN agency concerned with matters beyond tariffs, the divisions created by the USA in particular focused on Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, to establish the GATT and finally the WTO. However, over time, we are seeing, like the Reggie is mentioning, we are seeing this same organization coming back to promote global economic cooperation. When you look at, for instance, tax, and you talk about the pact, the platform of action on tax, and you look at the OECD, all of them are trying to forge a way for international cooperation on these matters. Are we seeing the International Trade Organization coming back? And that's the idea of pessimism vis-a-vis optimism at the UN level. Because there seems to be a discussion on convergency. If you look at the provisions in bilateral investment treaties, they are so much similar to the provisions in double taxation agreements. If you look at the discussion around vaccines and medicines, digital taxation, they also point to digital trade, the World Trade Organization. So we seem to be working on the same issues, but with a lack of a common converging position that can make decisions at a global level. So my food for thought for the panel is, do we, even if it may have another name, do we seem to think of an international body under the auspices of the UN that will integrate all these rather related aspects of economic cooperation, tax, investment, debt, and trade? Do we see that coming to fruition if we keep pushing? I submit and I thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for that question. Maybe Ranja, you can respond to some of that. Are we seeing a strengthening of the existing WTO that has had a problematic history, or do we need to be really thinking about establishing a new body, under the UN that not just looks at trade, but also the interconnections? I will also share another question that has come up, and I'm thinking maybe Emilia, you could respond to that. Are there changes beyond the specifics of any thematic area? Are there changes in the structure of the UN itself that you feel are necessary to support lasting movement towards a more just global order? So maybe Ranja first and then Emilia.
Yeah, I mean, you're very much right. And the WTO, of course, is increasingly becoming a body which has something to say almost on everything, but not always with very positive results. And tax, of course, we have seen, like, one is the whole issue of tariffs itself is clearly very closely linked to the issue of taxation, but also, what the WTO is now trying to talk about, investment facilitation, and then that, I mean, at the moment it's called investment facilitation, then it becomes investment promotion and liberalization and so on. But that then brings us back to this whole international investment framework. For example, countries are asked that, you should raise your own tax revenues, where when the government is trying to tax corporations, many of them are using the investment treaties to sue them. So it kind of goes back in full circle. But in WTO, we see a lot of these overlapping issues come in. And when we are seeing, environment is coming in, labor may come in. But the problem is, I think WTO cannot be the body. I mean, firstly, it engages in a limited way. Also, for example, on the digital taxation, etc. So there are a lot of these overlap with what the WTO does or can do, and all the other issues that we would really like to have, like a joint solution to. But why the WTO cannot be is it has firstly a limited lens, and we know that that politics of the WTO is being, at least to a certain extent, challenged by developing countries, and its mandate, I mean, when it tries to get into social issues like, now environment or labor before, it has always become very complicated. And we have really seen this in the fisheries subsidies negotiation, because from the SDGs, an environmental conservation mandate has been given to the WTO that it should discipline fisheries subsidies in order to actually do marine and conservation and protect marine resources. But the thing is, then again and again, we are coming up with the thing that the WTO is not really equipped to handle that job, and the very harsh commercial politics. WTO is not a body which we do not expect it, and very rightly so. We have seen this fear being, affirmed again and again, that whether it's on women's rights, when it talked about trade and gender, it talks about trade and environment, trade and labor, there's the tendency that these issues get hijacked and in pushing the agenda of the developed countries. And that is not why, and that's why again and again the WTO has failed, and the developing countries themselves have resisted that these issues should be brought into the WTO, because they are apprehensive that actually it is a very, there's an agenda behind this, very harsh commercial agenda. And we are seeing this in the fisheries subsidies negotiations right now. So, I mean, I think that's why I would still put my coins in the UN, and I think it has a better chance of, kind of actually providing that space, maybe, which could offer us more fairer and more comprehensive solutions. And it's not going to be an easy task. We have seen that it will be a big fight. We all have to be committed to this pretty long, I think, struggle. But I think we will at least maybe get something out of it.
Thank you, Ranja. And we're running out of time, so maybe Emilia, if you have like a short and quick response to that, and then we can wind it up. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we should ask Barbara Adams better. She has a lot of wisdom to share on this. I just will say, even though it doesn't sound structural, but we need to eradicate the corporate capture of the UN now, urgently, today, as of yesterday. But there are other things that I can think of. We wanted to have an FfD commission and not a forum, precisely to give it more powers, to have a legal dimension to the economic issues. People think that talking about economy, they think it's about money, but budgets, economy, it has a normative side, and people leave that aside all the time. And this is the very nature of the FfD. I think we need to make an urgent reform to the IFIs to make them compliant to not only human rights, gender equality, environmental, but really to the spirit of the UN, because as of now they are a negative force pulling against everything that the UN should stand for. And many things, HLPF should be outside of ECOSOC, etc. But let's organize another side event just to discuss this, because I think it is urgently needed. As much as these silos, I think it goes to the conversations we're having as well on how are we making these linkages.
Thank you, Emilia, and thank you everyone who have joined us today, the panelists, those of us who are listening to the webinar. As I think our speaker said, we have no alternative. I mean, this is the only space that we have to discuss issues of global economy and finance, and we have no alternative, and we cannot afford to be cynical. We are not naive. We know the political economy challenges of these issues, and we're up against very powerful governments and very powerful corporations. But we hope that we, through this process, also build the allies to start challenging the course of developments right now, and maybe a good start with the Mexican government on really thinking how can we take forward the Monterrey plus 20 idea, and work with also increasingly other government allies. So thank you everyone for joining, and look forward to staying in touch with next steps. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja, for facilitating and organizing.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Pooja.